The morning sun cut through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Richard Holloway's corner office on the 42nd floor of the Sentinel Financial Building in downtown Chicago, illuminating the mahogany desk where he sat reviewing termination paperwork with the clinical detachment of a surgeon removing something diseased. Sarah Mitchell stood on the other side of that desk in a blazer she'd bought at Goodwill and shoes she'd resold twice because buying new ones meant choosing between footwear and her daughter's school supplies. Her hands were clasped in front of her to hide the trembling that had started the moment Richard's assistant had called her up from the data processing department with the ominous message that Mr. Holloway needed to see her immediately. Richard didn't look up from the papers as he spoke, his voice carrying the particular coldness that comes from a man who'd spent 30 years building wealth by treating people as assets to be optimized or discarded. Ms. Mitchell, I'll be direct because I don't believe in wasting time. Your performance over the past 6 months has been consistently below department standards. You've missed deadlines. Your error rate exceeds acceptable thresholds. And your attendance record shows a pattern of tardiness and unexpected absences that suggests a lack of commitment to your role here. He finally looked up, his pale blue eyes meeting Sarah's brown ones, with an expression that showed no recognition of the woman standing before him, even though she had his jawline and his nose and his hands that she'd inherited, along with the abandonment that had defined her entire life. Effective immediately, your employment with Sentinel Financial is terminated. You'll have until the end of day to clear your desk. Security will escort you from the building. If that opening grabbed you by the throat, if you're already feeling the injustice building, and you know this is heading toward a revelation that will shatter this man's world, then you need to hit that like button right now. Share this with everyone who's ever been dismissed by people who should have seen them, who should have known them, who should have cared but chose power and profit over humanity. Subscribe to Acts of Depth because we tell the stories about moments when the past arrives like a reckoning, when secrets can't stay buried, when the people you've wronged become the voices you can no longer silence. Now let me take you back 30 years to understand exactly what Richard Holloway had done, who Sarah Mitchell really was, and why what she said next would haunt him for the rest of his life. Richard Holloway had been 28 years old when he'd walked out on his family in a 2-bedroom apartment in South Chicago. His daughter Sarah was 3 years old, and his wife Jennifer was pregnant with their second child. He'd been working at a mid-level position at an investment firm, earning decent money, but not the kind of wealth he'd dreamed about since growing up poor in a Cleveland trailer park. The marriage had felt like a trap. The crying baby had felt like a burden. The pregnant wife had felt like an anchor, preventing him from chasing the opportunities he convinced himself he deserved. So one Tuesday morning in 1993, Richard had kissed his daughter goodbye like it was any other day, told Jennifer he'd be home for dinner, and instead had gotten in his car and driven to New York City with everything he owned in 2 suitcases and a determination to become someone who mattered, regardless of who he had to leave behind. He'd sent divorce papers 6 months later through a lawyer. He'd signed away parental rights when Jennifer demanded child support he claimed he couldn't afford. And he'd spent the next 3 decades building Sentinel Financial into a company worth $400 million, while his daughter and the son he'd never met grew up in poverty that could have been prevented if Richard had been capable of caring about anyone except himself. Sarah Mitchell, born Sarah Holloway, had grown up knowing her father had abandoned them, but not knowing why. Her mother Jennifer had tried to shield her from the full truth, had made excuses about Richard being young and scared and unable to handle responsibility. But children aren't stupid, and Sarah had understood from about age 7 that her father had made a choice to value his own ambitions over his children's well-being. Jennifer had worked 3 jobs to keep them fed and housed. She'd cleaned offices at night and waited tables during the day and sold crafts at weekend markets to scrape together enough money to pay rent on apartments that always seemed one missed payment away from eviction. Sarah's younger brother Michael had been born with complications that required ongoing medical care. Jennifer had never remarried, had never had the time or energy to date when she was too busy surviving. And she died when Sarah was 19. Her body worn out from years of stress and untreated health problems that she'd ignored because going to the doctor cost money she needed for her children. Sarah had been left to raise her 14-year-old brother while working full-time and trying to finish the college degree she'd started on scholarship. She'd managed somehow, putting Michael through high school and into trade school while cobbling together a life from minimum wage jobs and night classes. Michael was 30 now, married with a daughter of his own, working as an electrician, and living the kind of stable life that had seemed impossible when they'd been kids eating ramen for dinner 4 nights a week. Sarah had her own daughter, 8-year-old Emma, from a marriage that had ended when her ex-husband had decided that family responsibility wasn't for him either, apparently validating some genetic curse that made the men in Sarah's life disappear when things got difficult. Sarah had been working at Sentinel Financial for 18 months, and Richard Holloway had never once looked at her closely enough to recognize the child he'd abandoned. She'd taken her ex-husband's last name when she'd married at 22, so Sarah Mitchell didn't trigger any recognition in Richard's mind when HR had sent him her file as part of the routine new hire approvals. She'd worked in the data processing department on the 34th floor, while Richard operated from his executive suite 8 floors above, and their paths had never crossed until 6 months ago when Richard had implemented a new management structure that required him to personally review the performance metrics of every department. That's when he'd started noticing that Sarah Mitchell had been late to work 17 times in 3 months and had left early on 12 occasions and had missed 4 full days without advance notice. What the metrics didn't show was that Sarah had been late because her daughter's school didn't have before care, and Sarah had to wait until her neighbor could watch Emma before she could leave for work. She'd left early because Emma had gotten sick and the school nurse had called requiring immediate pickup. She'd missed full days because Emma had strep throat and then the flu and then a stomach bug, and Sarah had no family in Chicago and couldn't afford childcare for a sick child. The performance metrics showed errors in Sarah's data processing work that exceeded acceptable thresholds, but they didn't show that Sarah had been working late into the night on a laptop that kept freezing and losing her work because she couldn't afford to replace it, or that the errors were concentrated in the period when she'd been dealing with her landlord, threatening eviction over a rent increase she couldn't absorb on top of Emma's medical bills. Richard Holloway didn't care about context. He cared about numbers, and Sarah's numbers were bad, so Sarah needed to go. He'd signed the termination order without a second thought and had told his assistant to call Sarah up for the meeting, where he'd deliver the news personally because Richard believed that firing people yourself rather than delegating it to HR showed leadership. Now Sarah stood in his office, absorbing the information that she was losing the job she desperately needed, the job that barely covered her rent but at least provided health insurance for Emma, the job she'd held for 18 months while never once revealing to anyone that the CEO of this company was the father who'd abandoned her before she was old enough to remember his face. She could leave quietly, take the termination and the 2 weeks of severance pay Richard was offering, and walk out of this building with her secret intact. Or she could tell him the truth and watch his world tilt on its axis the way hers had been tilted when she was 3 years old and too young to understand why Daddy wasn't coming home. Sarah uncast her hands and pulled a photograph from her blazer pocket, placing it on the mahogany desk between them. The photo was old and faded, showing a young man holding a small child on his shoulders. Both were smiling at the camera with the kind of joy that suggested the moment had been happy before it became a lie. Richard glanced at the photo with confusion. "What is this?" Sarah's voice was steady despite the storm in her chest. "That's you, Mr. Holloway. 30 years ago, and that little girl on your shoulders is me, your daughter, Sarah, the one you walked out on when I was 3 years old." The silence that followed was so complete that Sarah could hear the ventilation system humming and the muted sounds of traffic 42 floors below. Richard's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, disbelief, recognition, horror. He picked up the photo with hands that had started shaking, looking at his younger self and the child he'd tried to forget for 3 decades. "You're lying," he said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "This is some kind of scam. You're trying to—" Sarah pulled out her driver's license and her birth certificate, documents she'd brought to work today in her bag alongside her lunch, and Emma's school permission slip that needed signing. She placed them on the desk next to the photo. Sarah Holloway, born April 15th, 1990, parents listed as Richard Holloway and Jennifer Holloway. That's me. I took my ex-husband's last name when I got married, which is why you didn't recognize it when you hired me. Or maybe you didn't recognize it because you never bothered to remember you had a daughter in the first place." Richard was staring at the birth certificate like it was written in a language he couldn't quite translate. Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength from 30 years of anger she'd been carrying. I've been working here for 18 months. I've processed data for your company. I've stayed late when you needed reports rushed. I've never missed a deadline that wasn't related to my daughter being sick. And you're firing me for poor performance without ever once asking why my attendance has been spotty or whether I needed support to improve my work. She leaned forward slightly, her hands flat on his desk. You want to know why I've been late? Because I'm a single mother raising an 8-year-old daughter alone, the same way Mom raised me and Michael alone after you abandoned us. Because I can't afford before care at Emma's school on the salary you pay data processors. Because when Emma gets sick, I don't have family to help me because the only family I had was my mother, and she died from working herself to death trying to provide for the children you didn't want. Richard's face had gone pale. I wasn't aware. You weren't aware because you didn't care enough to ask, just like you didn't care enough to stay when I was 3. Just like you didn't care enough to send child support so Mom didn't have to work 3 jobs. Just like you didn't care enough to even check whether the children you abandoned were alive or dead. Sarah picked up the termination papers and held them up. You're firing me, fine. I need this job desperately, but I'll survive because surviving is what I learned to do when you left. But I want you to know who you're farting. I want you to understand that the employee you deemed unworthy of keeping is your own daughter. I want you to spend the rest of your life knowing that when I needed you most, when I was 3 and when I was 19 and Mom died, and when I was 28 and my husband left, and now when I'm 33 and barely making rent, you weren't there. Not because you couldn't be, but because you chose not to be. She turned to leave, then stopped at the door. I won't tell anyone here who I am. I won't embarrass you publicly or sue you or make this difficult. I'll clear my desk and leave quietly because, unlike you, I actually care about other people's dignity, even when they don't deserve it. But I hope you think about this moment every time you fire someone without knowing their story. I hope you remember that the numbers you're reviewing represent actual human beings with actual struggles. And I hope you live the rest of your life knowing that you abandoned your daughter twice, 30 years apart, and that says everything about who you are. Sarah walked out of Richard Holloway's office and closed the door behind her, leaving him sitting at his mahogany desk with a photograph of a life he'd discarded and the devastating recognition that he'd just fired his own child for the crime of struggling with circumstances he'd created. The elevator ride down to the 34th floor felt longer than it should have. Sarah packed her desk while her coworkers whispered and speculated about why she'd been called to the CEO's office. She carried her box of belongings past security and out into the Chicago morning that had started with a termination and ended with a truth that couldn't be taken back. She went home to her apartment where the rent was due in 2 weeks, and she had no idea how she'd pay it now that her paycheck was gone. She picked up Emma from school and made dinner from the groceries she'd stretched to last another 4 days. And she didn't cry until Emma was asleep because Sarah had learned at 3 years old that sometimes the people who should protect you will abandon you instead. And crying about it didn't change anything. Richard Holloway sat in his office for 3 hours after Sarah left, staring at the photograph and the birth certificate and the termination papers he'd signed with his daughter's name on them. He'd built an empire by being ruthless. He'd made $400 million by treating everything as a transaction and everyone as either useful or disposable. He'd told himself that walking away from his family had been necessary, that young fathers made mistakes, that he'd been too immature to handle responsibility, and leaving had been kinder than staying and resenting them. But looking at the evidence of Sarah's existence and the reality of what he'd just done, Richard couldn't maintain the comfortable lies he'd been telling himself for 30 years. He'd abandoned a 3-year-old child who'd grown into a woman trying desperately to provide for her own daughter the way Jennifer had provided for Sarah after he'd left. He'd been so focused on his own ambitions that he'd never once wondered what happened to the children he'd signed away. And when his daughter had been working in his own building for 18 months, when she'd been struggling with the exact kind of circumstances that his child support could have prevented, he'd fired her without even recognizing her face. Richard made a call to his head of HR. Sarah Mitchell, the termination I sign in today, I need it reversed immediately. I need her rehired with back pay and I need to know what we can do to support employees who are single parents and struggling with childcare. The HR director sounded confused but professional. Mr. Holloway, I can reverse the termination, but I should inform you that Ms. Mitchell has already left the building. And regarding support for single parents, we don't currently have any programs in place beyond standard P2. Then create programs, Richard said. On-site childcare, flexible scheduling, emergency backup care for sick children, whatever it takes to make sure employees who are doing their best aren't being punished for circumstances beyond their control. I want a proposal on my desk by Monday. He hung up and made another call, this one to his personal attorney. I need you to find someone for him. Her name is Sarah Mitchell. She used to be Sarah Holloway. I need her current address and phone number. The attorney asked why, and Richard found he couldn't lie. She's my daughter. I abandoned her 30 years ago, and I just fired her this morning without knowing who she was. I need to find her, and I need to try to fix what I broke. The attorney said he'd have the information by end of day. Richard sat alone in his office watching the sun move across the Chicago skyline and thinking about choices and consequences and the reality that money could buy almost anything except the ability to undo the damage you'd done to people who deserve better from you. Sarah's address came through at 6 p.m. Richard sat in his car outside her apartment building for 20 minutes trying to figure out what to say to a daughter who had every right to slam the door in his face. Finally, he got out and walked up 3 flights of stairs to apartment 3B and knocked on a door that was scratched and worn. Sarah opened it with Emma visible behind her, a small girl with dark hair eating cereal at a kitchen table visible through the doorway. Sarah's expression when she saw Richard was carefully neutral. "What are you doing here?" "I came to apologize," Richard said, "and to tell you that I've reversed the termination. Your job is waiting for you if you want it, with a raise and flexible scheduling and whatever support you need to make it work." Sarah's laugh was bitter. "You think offering me my job back fixes this? You think a raise makes up for 30 years? No," Richard said, "nothing fixes this. Nothing makes up for leaving you and your mother and your brother. Nothing excuses what I did then or what I did this morning. But I want to try to do better going forward. I want to know my daughter if you'll let me. I want to know my granddaughter. I want to help in whatever way you'll allow, even though I know I have no right to ask." Sarah looked at him with eyes that had seen too much hardship too young. "You left when I was 3. Mom died when I was 19 from working herself to death trying to fill the gap you left. My brother Michael grew up without a father. I raised him from 14 to 18 while trying to finish college. I married a man who left me the same way you left Mom, because apparently I learned to choose men who don't stay. And you want to help now, after I don't need you anymore?" "You do need me," Richard said quietly. "You need rent paid and medical insurance and childcare and all the things I should have been providing for 30 years. You need someone to be the father I failed to be. And I know I can't make up for lost time, but I can try to be present going forward if you'll give me the chance." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Emma had come to the doorway, curious about the visitor. "Mama, who is that?" Sarah looked at her daughter and then at Richard and made a calculation about grace and anger, and whether people who'd failed could genuinely change or if they just got better at pretending. "Emma, this is Richard. He's someone who's going to help us for a while. Why don't you finish your cereal?" She turned back to Richard. "You want to help? Fine. My rent is due in 2 weeks, and I'm $1,500 short now that I've lost my job. Emma needs in our lives. You're staying, because I will not let you abandon her the way you abandoned me. If you can't commit to that, leave now and don't come back." Richard pulled out his checkbook, the physical kind he rarely used anymore, but kept in his car for occasions when electronic transfers felt too impersonal. He wrote a check for $10,000 and handed it to Sarah. "That's for immediate expenses, rent and shoes and whatever else you need. And I'll set up a monthly transfer to make sure you're never in a position where losing a job means not being able to feed your daughter." He paused. "But more than money, I want to be present. I want to have dinner with you and Emma. I want to go to her school events. I want to be a grandfather who shows up. I know I was a terrible father. I'm asking for the chance to be better." Sarah took the check with hands that trembled slightly, looking at more money than she'd ever held at once. This doesn't mean I forgive you. This doesn't mean we're family again just because you wrote a check. But I'll let you try to be better. For Emma's sake more than mine. She deserves a grandfather who cares. I deserved a father who cared, and I didn't get one. So maybe I can give her something I didn't have. Richard nodded. That's more than I deserve. Thank you. He came to dinner the following Sunday, sitting awkwardly in Sarah's small apartment that cost a fraction of what he spent on his monthly car payment. Emma was shy at first but warmed up when Richard asked about her school and her friends, and actually listened to her answers instead of pretending to care. Sarah watched him interact with her daughter and saw glimpses of the father he might have been if he'd stayed, if he'd chosen differently, if he'd valued family over ambition. Over the following months, something unexpected happened. Richard became a fixture in their lives. He came to Emma's school play and her soccer games. He helped Sarah move to a better apartment in a safer neighborhood. He paid off her medical debt and her student loans. He set up college funds for Emma and for Michael's daughter. And slowly, painfully, Sarah began to believe that maybe people could change even when the damage they'd done seemed irreparable. Richard changed Sentinel Financial too. The company implemented on-site childcare, flexible scheduling, emergency backup care, programs specifically designed to support single parents and employees dealing with family obligations. The changes cost money, but they also reduced turnover and increased productivity because people who felt supported worked harder and stayed longer. Richard didn't talk publicly about why he'd implemented the changes, but the employees who benefited didn't need to know the story behind the policy to appreciate what it meant for their lives. Sarah went back to work at Sentinel, but not in data processing. Richard created a position for her in the corporate social responsibility department, working on programs that helped employees balance work and family. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that Sarah was now helping create the support systems that would have prevented her termination if they'd existed 18 months earlier. She was good at the work because she understood the struggles firsthand. She knew what single parents needed because she'd been one. And the programs she designed actually helped people instead of being performative gestures that looked good in annual reports but accomplished nothing. Richard and Sarah's relationship remained complicated. There were conversations about the past that left both of them raw. There were moments when Sarah's anger resurfaced and Richard had to sit with the discomfort of having caused pain he couldn't fix. But there were also moments of connection. Watching Emma's face light up when her grandfather arrived at her birthday party, sitting at dinner and laughing at something silly, building trust slowly through consistent presence rather than grand gestures. Michael eventually met Richard too, though that relationship was even more fraught because Michael had no memories of his father at all, only the abstract knowledge that someone had chosen not to know him. But Michael's daughter called Richard Grandpa, and that meant something even when the past was painful. 2 years after Sarah had walked into Richard's office and revealed who she was, Richard was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The prognosis was months, not years. He called Sarah and told her the news and waited to see if she would care enough to visit him or if the cancer would be poetic justice for a man who'd abandoned his family. Sarah came to the hospital every day. She brought Emma. She sat beside his bed and talked about work and Emma's school and the mundane details of life that became precious when you realized how little time remained. And one afternoon when Richard was lucid between pain medication doses, he said the thing he'd been trying to say for 2 years. I'm sorry, not just for firing you or for leaving you, for all of it, for choosing ambition over family, for convincing myself that you'd be fine without me, for 30 years of absence that no amount of presence now can make up for. I'm sorry and I love you, and I wish I'd been brave enough to stay.